So I'll be going over things like the timeline, adding keyframes, and using the graph editor to edit your animations. And then at the as well. So when you're doing animation, you need to add keyframes, and those double tap the A key and we'll press X to delete, and I'm going to delete everything. So I'll now can't use the default cube, you have to always add a new one. Alright, so let's just do some very basic animation to this cube. So I'm going to select the cube, and then I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to scrub this blue line here on the timeline, and I'm going to bring it Alright, so we are now at frame 1, and the cube is right here, and so I want to add a keyframe to tell it that that's where the cube is going to start. So to add keyframes, you are going to press the I button. So make sure your mouse is hovered in the 3D space, and then press I, and I is the shortcut key to inset a keyframe. Now you do have a bunch of different options here, and so this is asking you what values you want to add keyframes onto. And when you're animating objects in the 3D space, there are 3 main values that you're going to use: the location, the rotation, and the scale. So grab, that is going to change the location. If you press R to rotate, that'll change the rotation. And then if you press S, that is going to change the scale. So when you press I, it's going to ask you what values you want to add keyframes onto. Now, if you want to add a keyframe that's going to affect all three of those values, you can just click on this one right here, which is location, rotation, and scale. So after you press the I key, you can just click on any of these ones. I'm going to do the location, rotation, and scale. Now when I do that, you can see that right down here on the timeline, we have this little yellow diamond. And so that is Blender telling us that we have a keyframe on that part of the timeline. And also, if you press the A key to deselect the cube, you can see that now the diamond is gone. And so in the timeline, you're only going to be able to see the keyframes with the object that's selected. What values you want to add keyframes onto. Now, if you want to add a keyframe that's going to affect all three of those values, you can just click on this one right here, which is location, rotation, and scale. So after you press the I key, you can just click on any of these ones. I'm going to do the location, rotation, and scale. Now, when I do that, you can see that right down here on the timeline, we have this little yellow diamond. And so that is Blender telling us that we have a keyframe on that part of the timeline. And also, if you press the A key to deselect the cube, you can see that now the diamond is gone. And so in the timeline, you're only going to be able to see the keyframes with the object that's selected. So if I now select this object again, then there is the diamond. And also in the timeline, if you press the A key, just like selecting and deselecting objects, if you press A in the timeline, that is going to select and deselect the keyframes. So we have now inserted a keyframe right here. So I'm just going to move over to frame 100. So you can just scrub with the timeline, just click and drag and move over to frame 100. And I now just want to transform the cube. So I can just press G to grab, and I'll also rotate it. So I'll press R to rotate it. And if you wanted to, you could also press S to scale and just scale that up. Now, if we move our timeline or if we play the timeline, it's not going to keep this, and that's because we haven't added a keyframe on this value. So if I move this, you can see it's going to hop back to the original value. So I just need to do this again. So I'm going to bring it over, I'll rotate it, and then I'll also scale it. So we now need to add a keyframe right here to tell Blender that that's where we want the next keyframe to be on frame 100. So again, I'm going to press I, and I'm going to click on location, rotation, and scale. So now that I've done that, if I scrub through the timeline, you can see it's going from the first keyframe to the second keyframe. Now I'm just going to press Ctrl Z to undo that, and if I press I again to add a keyframe, this time I could just click on rotation, and you can see now that I did that, it's moving the location, but because I didn't add this keyframe for the rotation and the scale as well, it's only going to add a keyframe to the location, and so the rotation and scale aren't going to be changed. Now to be able to visualize this a little bit better, if I press the N key, that is going to open up this side panel, and I'm going to go right down here to Item. And you can see right here on item, we now have this transform tab right here. So this is showing us the transform values for this object. So as I talked about earlier, we have 3 different transform values. We have the location, and that is going to be moving it around. We have the rotation to rotate it, and then we have the scale to scale it up or down. And each of these transform values have 3 values within them because we have the X and the Y and the Z axes. So those are all the axes in the 3D space. So I'm just going to press Ctrl Z to undo that a few times, and then I now want to add a keyframe, but this one I want to affect the location, rotation, and scale. So I'll press I again, and then I'm going to click on location, rotation, and scale. And now it's done it for all the values. So now if I click and drag to scrub the timeline, you can see it is rotating and scaling the cube as well. Now you may have noticed something, and that is that these values right here have different colors. So if there are no keyframes on these values, they're just going to be the default gray. So you can see all these different values here in Blender, they're just normally the default gray color. If there is animation on those values, then they are going to be green. So green is basically telling you that there is animation on that value, but there isn't a keyframe on that exact frame. If I move over to frame 100 where there is a keyframe, they're going to turn yellow, and that is Blender telling you that there is a keyframe right at that part in time. So you can animate the cube in the 3D space, but you can also animate these values. So let's say I want to go over to maybe 150, and then I want to change the location and rotation. So what I can do is I can click and drag, and I can drag these values. So let's just move the cube over, and then also maybe I want to rotate the cube, so we're going to rotate that over. So now what I can do is I can just add keyframes to these values because these are the only ones that are changed. So to add keyframes to these values, I could press I and then insert a location and rotation and scale, or in this case just a location and rotation because I didn't actually change the scale. But instead what I can do is I can just hover my mouse over the values, and then I can press I, and that is going to add a keyframe to these values. So I can hover my mouse over this value and press I, that is going to add a keyframe to the values. And I can also just right click, and I can right click on these values, and then you can see I can add a keyframe, or in this case I can replace the keyframe because I already have a keyframe at that value. And now if you scrub through the timeline, you can see that it moves up here, and then we have the other keyframes, and so the cubes moves over. And I will go over this later on in this tutorial, but you can animate pretty much any value in Blender. So just like we animated these, you can animate pretty much any value in Blender, all these different values in Blender, but I'll go over that in a moment. So I'm going to press the N key now to close that side panel. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about how to use the timeline. So if you just click and drag right up here on these numbers, then that is going to move the timeline around. Now, if you want to play the timeline, you can click on the play button right here, and that is going to play the timeline. And then you can see there is also a pause button. So you can click on that pause button to pause the timeline. And then there also is a play backwards. So you can click on that button, and that is going to play the animation backwards. And you may also see me just clicking and dragging right down here. That is because I'm using the right click select, so I can click and drag right down here. But for most of you who are using the left click select, you'll just click and drag right up here on the numbers. Now there also are some other buttons right here. So these buttons jump to the next keyframe. So if you click on that, it's going to jump to the next keyframe in the timeline. And you can also click on this button here, and that is going to jump back. Now these buttons right here on the very outer edges, those are going to jump to the start frame and the end frame. So if you click on this, you can see it's going to go to frame 1, and if I click on this, it's going to go to frame 250. So depending on how long your animation is, you can change the start and end frame. So for instance, I could just have my animation end at frame 160, but you can see the default is 250. So if I just click on this end value right here, I can just type in 160 and then hit enter, and you can see now the end frame is going to move to here. Now another thing you can change is the frame rate. So if you click right over here on the output properties, let me just make this a little bit bigger, you can change the frame rate. So the frame rate is basically telling Blender how many frames are going to be within 1 second. So the FPS, that stands for frames per second. Now the default is 24 frames per second, and for most things 24 frames per second is going to be just fine for your animations. I am recording this video in 60 frames per second because I want it to be nice and smooth. I'm using OBS, my screen recording software, to record this, but for most animations and things, you're just going to use 24 frames per second. If you want it to be more smooth, you could turn it up. So for instance, I could turn it up to 60, and that's going to be a lot more smooth. So basically now if I play this, you can see it's much faster, but it's also much more smooth. So if I change this to 60 frames per second, there's now going to be 60 frames within every second. and you can see it's much more smooth now than 24 because there are more frames in every second. I'm just going to change this back to 24, which is the default. For most animations, usually animations are 24 frames per second. Now, if you've added some keyframes, but you want to edit those keyframes or change them, or maybe you want to change the timing, then you can do that. So let me first show you how to change the timing. So what you can actually do is you can actually just select the keyframe. You can press G to grab in the timeline, and that is going to move the keyframe. So if I wanted this to move up much quicker, I could press G to grab and then move over, and I could place it right here. And now if I play this, you can see it's going to move up much faster. And I could also just select this, press G to grab, and bring it over, and that way it's going to move much faster. And then if you have a keyframe selected, you can press X to delete, and then you can just click on delete keyframes. You can also press the delete key, and then that's going to delete the keyframe. So I'll just delete that, so X to delete, and now if I move through this, you can see that because we deleted that keyframe in the middle, it's just going to go from this keyframe to that keyframe. Now let's say that I want the cube to pause in this location, and I just want to pause for a little while, and then we'll have another keyframe and have it move over. So what I would want to do is I would want to duplicate this keyframe so that it stays right where it is and it doesn't move. So you can just select the keyframe, and then you can press Shift D, and so Shift D will duplicate the keyframe, just how Shift D will duplicate the object in the 3D space. You can press Shift D, and that's going to duplicate the selected keyframe. Now I'm just going to delete this keyframe real quick, and I want to show you another way that you could do this. So you could just simply move over to frame 90 or wherever you want to move it to, and then you could press the I key again, and you could insert location, rotation, and scale. And you can see now it's just going to stay where it is and it's not going to move. Now you can see that in between these two keyframes there is a little line here, and if you press A to select